This video is just going to give you an overview of project management. And I want to focus mostly on the sort of softer side of project management. There is the bit more technical section that deals with project scheduling that I will do in a subsequent piece. So I just want to just use this opportunity to give you just a quick overview. Projects exist in our environment all the time. In an organization, there's often some new initiative that needs to be implemented, a new piece of equipment, a new piece of technology being launched, a new product being designed out of a strategic plan or business plan. There is some recommendation that is being implemented, and often this is a one-time thing, and we could therefore classify it as a project. So it means that in the field of operations, when are we dealing with improvements, changes, initiations, new products, and so on, identifying and establishing a relationship with new suppliers, those things can be defined as projects. And if they are, then we need to know a little bit about project management so that we can take on those initiatives within the realm of operations and make sure that we execute them effectively. So, what is a project? A project is defined typically as something that is temporary, and we want to create a unique product or a service or some kind of output, a result. And so there's a definite beginning and an end. So we will start on January 1st and finish on May 31st or March 31st. And we have a team that usually works within the project, but it does not outlive the project. And when the project is done, that project team is actually done. Either product or artifact is produced, or a new service is launched. There's some kind of output that is created at the end of that project. And for example, it could be a capability to perform a service as well. Or sometimes we produce outputs, such as documents, or we might create knowledge, which is an outcome. All right? So we have a combination of things that you could produce from a project initiative. For example, if you initiate a project around public awareness about a particular issue, say a particular public health issue, a sort of a like the H1N1 virus, for example. Well, that campaign, if it was actually viewed as a project, would have a definite beginning and an end. And at the end of that campaign, you want people to be aware. You want them to have knowledge, and that's an example of an output, right, or an outcome. Um, as part of that definition, we could expand that and say the application of knowledge, skills, tools, and techniques to project activities to meet the project requirements. So we have to bring to bear all that is necessary to create that product output or outcome, if you wish. It has a number of processes that are fairly common in all across projects. We call them initiating processes, planning processes, execution processes, monitoring processes, and closing processes. These are also phases as well within project management. All right. So typically, in terms of managing a project initiative, now some of the ones that we typically think of is like building a new building, a stadium, or roads and so forth. So there's typically a set of requirements, and there are some clear and hopefully achievable objectives. And the reason why I say that is because often major projects are started and the objectives are not fully achieved. But one would like to believe that when the project is conceptualized, that the objectives are achievable. Often there are some competing demands for quality, scope, time, and cost. And so project management, as a result, involves trade-offs. You might want something to finish quickly, but then if you lengthen the scope, then it may not be able to finish it quickly. Project management also includes adapting specifications, plans, and the approach to different concerns and expectations of stakeholders. So it is not uncommon to have stakeholders, and those stakeholders have issues, And as part of the process, you got to figure out how you incorporate their views and their ideas into the actual project plan. All right. A project has a life cycle, and at each stage of the life cycle, a number of different things are done. So it's kind of useful to get a feel for that. There's a definition phase of the life cycle. You actually do the planning, the execution, and then the delivery and closeout. It almost looks like a product life cycle. We specify in the definition phase the goals, the project specs, the tasks that needs to be done, the responsibilities, the teams, the communication requirements, how we'll interface with our stakeholders, and so on. So you do a lot of pre-planning that allows you to be able to move that project forward fairly smoothly. Then in the planning stage, we look at scheduling and budgets and resources and risk and staffing issues. So, when will each activity start and begin, hopefully begin? What kind of budget resources we need, and we need to allocate that. What kind of other equipment and other types of resources, human resources, we need as well. And then the anticipated risks that we need to plan for. During execution, you would have a number of status reports, so it's not uncommon to have regular meetings. And then if there are changes to be made, the changes are planned for, they're catered, and then the projects are adjusted in terms of the cost or adjusted in terms of the time, etc. Quality issues in terms of measuring, and quality in this context is largely conformance to the specs. That's how we define it. And so to what extent that the specs are being adhered to or that they will actually be achieved. And then we have forecasts of the outputs and so on. So, or just also forecasts of the availability of labor, or even whatever demands that are made on the project, just getting a sense of what might potentially happen. All right. We're also looking at in the delivery phase, training the customer, transferring documents, releasing resources, reassigning staff, and then of course examining lessons that are learned from the project, the entire project initiative. All right. Project management needs to be integrated. There's a customer, and then of course there's an environment that's impacting that customer's requirements. Out of the environmental analysis, a company might generate some priorities, and then from the priorities, a number of project initiatives are identified. The project then has scope, breakdown, structure. So there's a systemic side of it, networks, resources, and costs, and there's the environmental and culture side of it, which is the organization, the leadership, the teams, the partners, and then of course we want to implement that. So this is just kind of like a systems view of project management and how it comes together. If you look at the yin and the yang, there's the technical part, and then there's the socio-cultural aspect of project management. When for those of us who come from engineering backgrounds, we tend to see the sort of technical side of things in terms of scheduling, time, book breakdown structures, and so on. But there's also the soft side in terms of trying to work with multiple vendors within a project, if a project is large scale, and then doing a lot of problem solving, hand holding, negotiating, dealing with the politics, and then of course managing customer expectations and stakeholder expectations at the same time. So project management can get quite complex, even on the soft side of things, right? We could actually apply project management to strategic planning as a tool for implementation of a strategic plan. I just want to mention that. So project provides a means for achieving an organization's strategic plan. The following strategic considerations may drive projects. For example, new market demand. So if the demographic changes and then you want to initiate a new product design, that would be a project. You may have an organizational need for reducing late deliveries, and there could be an initiative that will address that. Customer requests for new product or new technological innovation being implemented, RFID, etc. And so there are many opportunities for considering project management as a vehicle for assisting with implementation. So here's from St. Mary's academic plan a few years ago. Um, we see here, for example, develop. I'm taking the third one. Develop and or strengthen university prep courses, access programs for underrepresented groups, academic help centers, and peer support programs. So if you want to actually take this on, where you have to develop these prep courses, those are projects. They could have a definite beginning and an end, and a set of activities in between, and at the end you have the prep courses that are generated. And so they become the outputs of that project. So, so let's go for the phases. First phase is define the project. So you don't jump into a project. You need to know exactly what is it you're trying to accomplish. And so there's, if you think of a case where you're viewing this from the potential project manager or and then you have an external customer or client, this is kind of how we're viewing what we're about to read here. So you would have an initial client project meeting. So a meeting with your client so that you understand exactly what their wishes are, what kind of timing, what are the specs that they require around quality, costs, what budget do they have. So that you have that initial meeting to try to establish something. And then you get into a bit more detail where you actually come up with a project definition or project charter, a document that describes the purpose, objectives, scope, and deliverables of that project. It's actually quite useful to work with a project charter because it's a document that can be shared so everybody's on the same page. How will we approach the particular project? So if you understand the project life cycle, then you're going to describe all the phases in that life cycle and how that will actually be approached by your project management group, okay, or team. I'm going to provide this PowerPoint, so I'm going to leave some of these things for you to read yourself. So that's basically the client meeting that we're getting into. The project definition, let me just go through this because this is crucial. The project definition describes exactly the common understanding, its extent and nature among key people involved in a project. You don't want people working at odds with each other. They must be on the same page. They must define the project in the same way. The definition provides a foundation upon which successful projects are built. In many cases, the definition serves as a sort of contract between the parties participating in a project, clearly stating expectations for project time, resources, and results. So you see why definition is so crucial. All right? And then so it involves usually a problem statement, or what the problem is that needs to be addressed, a project name, the Kanzu Bridge project, or whatever it is, you know, the let's see, if you're creating a new car that is supposed to cost under $10,000, well, you could call it the under $10,000 car project. Give it any name. Project description. Provide a brief narrative, right, including the context and background for the project. The objectives, we will stipulate what the objectives are. This project is one of the objectives is to create a car that costs under $10,000 to be able to market that car in developing economies, blah, 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 and so forth. Scope. A first draft of what will and will not be included in the project. Scope is so crucial, but very rarely does a project actually end with the scope that it started off with. So hence the scope changes so that we must be able to manage and plan for. And then the customer delineates specifically who is the customer. You must know who that person is. Project scope, I could articulate that by what we call an is not list. This project is about a car. It's not about solving a transportation problem. It is about creating affordable cars for developing markets and so forth. And so you could figure out what the project is, but also it's important to stipulate what it is not, because they have people who will want all sorts of things. So, for example, if you're going to build a neighborhood swimming pool, you could say it is a recreational facility, it is a project that is supposed to provide enjoyment for young people. It is not an Olympic pool. It is not for competitive purposes, right? And it's not meant to be the best and biggest pool in the country. You know, you could what it is, what it is not. All right, very important to state that up front. Project approach, we already said that you have the various phases of the project life cycle. So it describes what the approach that would be taken to carry out a project. The life cycle segments the project into phases, logical units of work that fit together, and whose results make sense to review as a unit. Typical phases of an application development project includes examples like requirements analysis, logical design, technical design, etc. For each phase, the life cycle describes the major categories of results and the testing, quality assurance, and review needs of each of those phases. All right? So in terms of the various aspects of the approach, you could get into the name, to what project or group of projects does the life cycle apply, phases, how the project activities grouped and sequenced, testing and reviews, and so forth. So these are all the various parts. Planning the project. So how do we go ahead with this? You have a project team that kicks off a meeting to say, okay, folks, here's a definition. We've defined our project. Now let's begin to talk about our project charter, discuss roles, etc., timings and schedules and all that stuff. Then we have to come up with a list of tasks for that particular initiative. If we're going to build that bridge, what are all the tasks? If we're going to build that swimming pool, what are the tasks? If we're going to build that car, what are the tasks? If we're going to produce a report, what are the tasks involved? And so forth. Resource assessment, what kind of resources would be needed by that project? And there's all kinds of resources, financial resources, human resources, equipment resources, land, etc., software, all of that is important. The staffing plan, so who will work and what roles and responsibilities there will be for each of those individuals. In planning the project, we also need to describe or define the schedule. So the time aspect, time allocation. Each activity has an estimated time, but then we also have what we call precedence relationships. Some activities must be completed before the others, and so we want to be able to put that together to get a sense of the workflow. Communication plan, you got to communicate with your project sponsor, with the project participants, the stakeholders, the customer, all of those things. And so communication plan is crucial. If it's not communicated effectively, there's a pretty good chance that the project can be viewed as a failure in certain parts because people were not aware of what was going on. A client kickoff meeting, meet with the project clients to review the plans. Project integration. The project manager, as part of doing project planning, should identify key areas with which the project must integrate, must be a part of. Some projects don't stand on their own, and so therefore they must be integrated with others. All right? And in terms of the task list, you can see the purpose of a task list is to state exactly what needs to be done, how long it should take, and who should do it, etc. One of the ways to identify a task list is through a technique called a work breakdown structure, where essentially we take a project and break it down into multiple levels. And here's an example of a hierarchical breakdown of a project. Here's the overall project. And if we could identify all the major deliverables, what needs to be produced, and then for each deliverable, if there are sub-deliverables and then other levels of deliverables, you can go as many levels as you want, depending on the amount of detail you require. And then if we could assign some of these sub-deliverables to cost accounts so that we are able to kind of monitor the costs associated with parts of the project. And then of course there's something called a work package, which is the identifiable work activities that make up a project. So if you're making a computer, for example, part of your work package might be sort of just soldering, doing work on the motherboard, might be an example, or maybe something to do with just fixing up the monitor, or some other part of the computer that you have to work on, installing the hard drive, etc. So here's an example of a personal computer project. Level 1 is the project is the computer prototype. 2, we have deliverables, vendor software application, mouse and keyboard, voice disk storage units, the multiprocessor. Then as we go further down, from the disk storage you could see things like floppy, optical or hard disk. If we now go down even further, we're starting to get into sub-deliverables such as the modem, the circuit board, the chassis, the reader-write head, and then we go now even further down here, which is the work packages now. From the modem, you have one work package. With the circuit board, you have many work packages right here. So there are a number of different things you might be doing on that circuit board itself. And maybe such as soldering the sort of network connectivity parts to that motherboard. That section could be one work package. The chassis and the frame, again, we break it down into several work packages. So the more you could actually detail your project, the more it allows you to be able to specify all the critical activities that go into that project. All right. Of course, we need to assess the resources required for that particular project as well. Scheduling is a very important section, and this is where in our next video we'll talk a bit about project scheduling. It's essentially deals with taking all of the tasks, all of the activities, and then determining their sequence and when each of them are going to start and end so the project can be completed on time. So project scheduling allows you to manage the time to completion of a project as effectively as possible. Okay. The communication plan, I think we mentioned that basically you need to communicate with all of your stakeholders, your customers, your clients, your sponsors, and it is a crucial part of any successful project implementation, because without effective communication, people will draw their own conclusions about your project success. All right. In terms of executing the project, we have project team status meetings so that people know what's going on, and usually do this routinely, either on a daily basis to get updates. Project status reports, so you may ask for weekly status reports on various parts of the project. And then you have a client status meetings when you meet with the client to give them an update on what's taking place. One of the things that tends to happen in that in execution that you want to focus on is risk. And risk assessment becomes a very important part, because you need to plan to mitigate against risk so that the project can actually complete on time, on budget, right? And in scope. So what we tend to do is to think about all the potential risk events that could happen over here, and the chances of them happening. You could indicate the chance of happening, the severity, our ability to detect it, and when is it likely to happen. So this is what this risk asset matrix allows us to do. So system freezing, chance of it happening low, but if it happens, its severity is high. Can we detect it? The ability to detect it is high. Difficulty, sorry, is high. And when do we detect it? Usually at the startup, when the computer is actually starting up. Okay, but we can't tell ahead of time if the system is going to freeze. Only after it's frozen we believe. If it keeps freezing, then chances are then we can predict that it's going to freeze. The user backlash, hardware malfunctioning. So essentially, once we identify all of those, it allows us then to create actions to, particularly for the ones that have high severity and a pretty good chance of happening. You want to then focus on strategies to minimize those. Okay, so here we go. As a risk event, we could either accept it, reduce it, share it, transfer it, and then what is the contingency plan? So if the system keeps freezing, we want to reduce that from happening, actually like eliminate it. We could reinstall the operating system. When would you do that? If it is still frozen. So these actions indicate will be triggered by by a set of criteria. So if it's still frozen after 1 hour, then you will reinstall the operating system. Okay, so I just wanted to share this part here with you. Closing out the project, last but not least, is that after the project has pretty much been executed, then you're checking off your list to make sure everything was done. You meet with your client to wrap up, and the handoff. The team needs to meet just to kind of debrief and figure out what went right, what went wrong, and then of course you write a final closure report that is submitted to your sponsor and your client. Also, too, there should be a stakeholder wrap-up meeting, which is not there because, particularly for public projects, it's important to go back to the public and let them know exactly what has happened, so that they're more accepting of the project outcomes. Okay, so we'll end right here, and in our next video, take a look at the sort of more technical side of project management, which is project scheduling.